The warm water enveloped her body, the candlelight flickering against the porcelain of the bathtub. Soft classical music played from a speaker in the corner, blending with the rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet. For a rare moment, Elena allowed herself to relax. Then footsteps. Not from the hallway. Not from downstairs. They were inside the bathroom. Elena's eyes snapped open, her breath hitching in her throat. The steam blurred the edges of the figure standing at the doorway, but she recognized the silhouette instantly. No. It couldn't be. Liam. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Her stepson, her husband's son, stood frozen, his hand gripping the doorframe as if steadying himself against a sudden impact. His face was pale, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite decipher. "What are you doing?" she asked, an icy unease creeping over her skin despite the heat of the bathwater. Liam didn't answer at first. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. "I know." 2 words. Simple. But they shattered the air between them like a gunshot. Elena's heartbeat roared in her ears. She reached for the towel draped over the side of the tub, but Liam took a slow step forward. "Don't." Her hand stopped. The water swayed gently around her as she tried to process the weight of his words. "I know what," she forced out, keeping her voice steady. His lips parted, but no sound came at first. Then, he exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "I saw you." Every nerve in Elena's body went rigid. Her grip on the edge of the tub tightened. The room, which had been a sanctuary just moments ago, now felt suffocating. "Liam," she began, forcing calm into her voice. "You're confused." "I'm not," he interrupted, his voice harder now. "I saw you. At the hotel. Last night." Her stomach plummeted. A cold dread washed over her, heavier than the water encasing her body. Liam's hands curled into fists at his sides, his entire body taut, as if holding back a storm that had been brewing for too long. "I followed you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I saw who you were with." Elena's mind spun, desperately searching for an escape, an excuse, a lie, anything. But the look in his eyes told her the truth was already suffocating him. He knew. She thought she had covered her tracks. She thought she had been careful. But she had underestimated him. The weight of her secret, the delicate balance she had tried so hard to maintain, was crumbling. And Liam was standing in the wreckage. "I just need you to tell me one thing," he said, stepping closer now. His expression unreadable. His voice unsteady. Elena braced herself, gripping the edge of the bathtub as if it were the only thing keeping her afloat. Liam swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he finally asked, "Does my father know?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elena had always been the picture of composure. The kind of woman who turned heads without trying, whose presence carried an air of effortless grace. She had built a life that, from the outside, seemed enviable: a marriage to a successful man, a beautifully curated home, and a quiet stability that most would have considered the ultimate success. Her husband, Richard, was older than her by nearly 15 years, a man of discipline and stature. He had built his career with relentless ambition, and his wealth afforded them a life of luxury. Their house, a modern, sprawling estate tucked away in an affluent neighborhood, was meticulously maintained, a reflection of the order Richard demanded in all aspects of his life. The kind of home where expensive artwork adorned the walls, where fresh flowers were arranged weekly by a housekeeper, and where silence often spoke louder than words. At first, Elena had admired his certainty, the way he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who never had to ask twice for what he wanted. She had been drawn to the security he offered, the promise of a life without struggle, without uncertainty. But over time, the admiration had settled into something more complicated, something unspoken and carefully concealed beneath polite smiles and routine gestures. Richard was not unkind, but he was distant. His love was measured in grand gestures rather than intimacy, in lavish gifts rather than whispered words in the dark. When he traveled for work, which was often, he left behind expensive jewelry on her nightstand, as if each gleaming token could fill the empty spaces between them. Their marriage, once warm with new beginnings, had become something more structured, more predictable. Like a well-rehearsed play where both actors knew their lines but had long since stopped feeling the emotion behind them. And then there was Liam. Richard's son from his first marriage, Liam had been a teenager when Elena first entered their lives. At 16, he had been sullen and withdrawn, a boy whose world had already been fractured by divorce, now forced to accept a stepmother who was barely a decade older than him. Their relationship had been tenuous at best, built on small, careful interactions, her knocking on his bedroom door before entering, him offering curt one-word answers when she asked about school. Over the years, the resentment had softened, but a true closeness had never quite formed. She had tried, in those early days, to be a presence in his life without overstepping. She had attended his soccer games, learned his favorite meals, asked him about his interests. But Liam had always kept her at arm's length, polite but guarded. And Richard, ever pragmatic, had simply told her to give it time, as if time alone could stitch together the broken seams of a family that had never quite fit together. Now, at 23, Liam had grown into a young man who bore his father's sharp features but carried himself with an intensity that was entirely his own. He had inherited Richard's quiet strength, but there was something else beneath the surface, something deeper, more complicated. A sense of unrest that Elena had noticed but never dared to address. Their family life was a delicate balance, a routine of shared dinners that were more obligation than connection, of brief exchanges in hallways, of Richard discussing business over meals while Elena and Liam filled the silence with carefully chosen words. And yet, beneath the surface of this carefully curated life, there were cracks. Subtle, nearly invisible to those who didn't know where to look. There were the late nights when Richard came home long after dinner, the faint scent of perfume lingering on his suit. The business trips that seemed to multiply, stretching into longer and longer absences. The way he spoke to her, sometimes not cruelly, but with a detachment that made her feel less like a wife and more like an accessory. There was the way she had stopped waiting up for him. The way she had stopped asking where he had been. And then there was Liam. In the past year, something had shifted between them, though she couldn't quite define when or how. Their conversations had grown less strained, their interactions more natural. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she caught him looking at her in a way that was different than before. Not with resentment. Not with indifference. But with something else. And she had looked back. She had told herself it was nothing. That she was imagining things. That the growing distance between her and Richard had made her hypersensitive to the attention of someone who actually saw her. But she knew better. She had felt it in the way her breath caught when their hands brushed as he passed her a dish at dinner. In the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met across the room. In the way she avoided being alone with him for too long, not because she feared him but because she feared herself. She had been walking a fine line, carefully avoiding the thoughts she refused to name. She had convinced herself that as long as she never crossed it, as long as she never acknowledged what lingered unspoken between them, then nothing would come of it. But something had come of it. And now, sitting in the warm water of her bath, hearing the weight of Liam's footsteps approach, she realized. The line had already been crossed. And there was no going back. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't something Elena could explain outright, but she could feel it in the way the walls seemed to hold their breath, in the way conversations hovered on the edge of meaning without ever fully landing. Richard was away again. Another business trip, another series of late-night phone calls where his voice sounded distant, as if he were somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. She had long since stopped asking where he was staying or when he would be back. The answers never mattered. What mattered was that the house felt different when he was gone, that it breathed easier, that Elena felt something close to relief when she wasn't expected to perform the role of dutiful wife. And then there was Liam. He had been staying at the house more often lately. At 23, he had his own place downtown, but he kept finding reasons to be there, unfinished projects in his old room, packages being delivered, an old suit that needed retrieving. Excuses that felt paper-thin but were never questioned. At first, Elena had barely noticed. She told herself he had always been around like this, that nothing was different. But then there were the moments. The almosts. The lingering glances that stretched too long, the way she caught him watching her from across the room when he thought she wasn't looking. There were the nights when they ended up in the kitchen at the same time, moving around each other in the glow of the refrigerator light, silence thick between them. The way his fingers brushed hers when he passed her a plate. The way he never quite looked away fast enough. She told herself it was in her head. That she was imagining things because she was lonely, because Richard barely looked at her anymore, because the house had become a place where words carried weight but lacked warmth. But then there were the other things. the small, quiet betrayals of habit that had begun to stack up like bricks, forming a wall she could no longer ignore. One evening, she had been folding laundry in their bedroom when she found a receipt tucked into the pocket of one of Richard's suit jackets. A hotel in the city. A dinner for two. She had stared at it for a long time before slipping it back where she found it, her hands strangely steady. She had known, of course. Not the details, not the name, but she had known. That night at dinner, she had said nothing. She had sat across from Liam and Richard, listening to them talk about the stock market, about some new business venture, about things that had nothing to do with the growing chasm inside her. Liam had caught her eye once, his expression unreadable. She had held his gaze for a second too long before forcing herself to look away. Days passed, and the tension built in slow, insidious ways. Liam started sitting closer to her on the couch, their knees nearly touching as they watched some mindless show that neither of them was really paying attention to. He started offering to help her with things Richard never noticed, bringing in groceries, fixing the cabinet door that had been loose for weeks. He was always there, always near, and Elena felt herself being pulled into something she wasn't sure she could escape. One evening, as she was washing dishes, she felt him step behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. He reached around her, grabbing a glass from the drying rack, his arm brushing against hers. She sucked in a breath, but neither of them moved. For a moment, it felt like something was going to break, like a current running beneath the surface was about to surge forward. But then he stepped away, clearing his throat. She turned to look at him, but he was already walking out of the room. The next morning, Richard called from some city she no longer bothered keeping track of. He was distracted, his answers clipped. He said he would be home in a few days. When she hung up, she realized Liam had been standing in the doorway, watching her. "He's not coming back when he says he will," Liam said quietly. She didn't respond, because she knew he was right. By the time Richard did return, the weight of the silence had become unbearable. Something in the house had shifted in his absence, and even he could sense it. He stood in the entryway, looking around as if trying to pinpoint what had changed. His eyes landed on Elena, then on Liam, before flickering away. That night at dinner, Richard talked about work, about deals and meetings, about numbers that meant nothing to her. Liam barely spoke. Elena barely ate. Halfway through the meal, Richard's phone buzzed on the table. A name flashed across the screen, a woman's name. He glanced at it, then at Elena, before turning the phone over without answering. Liam set his fork down. The sound was soft, but it cut through the quiet like a gunshot. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. They were all waiting. Waiting for something to break. Waiting for the moment when everything would come undone. The water had begun to cool, the once soothing warmth now barely clinging to Elena's skin. She had lost track of time, letting the bath stretch on longer than she intended, the steam slowly fading from the air. The only sounds were the occasional drip from the faucet and the faint hum of wind pressing against the windowpane. She leaned her head back against the porcelain, eyes closed, exhaling slowly. Her muscles felt loose, but her mind remained restless. She had hoped the water would quiet the unease that had settled inside her over the past few weeks, but it lingered, coiling in her chest, waiting. A sound. Not the pipes creaking, not the wind. Something else. The soft creak of the bathroom door opening. Elena's eyes flew open, her body tensing beneath the water. The candlelight cast a flickering glow, illuminating the faint outline of a figure in the doorway. For a brief second, she thought it was Richard. That somehow he had come home earlier than expected, walking in on her without warning. But then her vision cleared, and her stomach dropped. Liam. He stood there, one hand gripping the doorframe, his face barely visible in the dim light. A rush of heat flooded her body, not from the bath, but from the sharp stab of shock coursing through her veins. "Liam," she breathed, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" He didn't move. His gaze wasn't wandering, wasn't awkwardly flickering away the way she might have expected if this had been a mistake, a moment of unintentional intrusion. Instead, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Elena." His voice was quiet, steady. Something about the way he said her name sent a ripple of unease through her. Her pulse quickened. "You can't be in here," she said, keeping her voice calm, controlled, even as she reached for the towel draped over the side of the tub. He didn't step back. "Elena," he said again, softer this time. "There's something you need to know." She froze, her hand pausing mid-reach. There was something in his voice. Something that made her breath hitch, made her heart stutter against her ribs. This wasn't about her. It wasn't about them. Something else was wrong. "Liam," she said carefully, "whatever it is, this isn't the time." His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I can't wait," he said. "I should have told you before. I just didn't know how." The water lapped against her skin as she slowly sat up, droplets trailing down her arms. She felt exposed, vulnerable not because of her body, but because of the way he was looking at her. Like he was about to shatter something she didn't even know was fragile. "Tell me what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I found something," he said. A chill crept up her spine. "Found what?" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "In my dad's office," he said. "I wasn't looking for anything, I swear. He cut himself off, exhaling sharply before meeting her gaze. "I found a safe." Elena's brows knitted together. Richard had a safe, of course. She had seen it before, though she had never paid much attention to it. "And," she prompted. Liam swallowed hard. "I figured it was just financial stuff. Maybe some legal documents, business papers, whatever." But it was unlocked. Elena felt her grip tighten on the edge of the tub. "Liam." "There were files inside," he continued, his voice hollow now. "About me. About you. About my mother." The room suddenly felt smaller, the candlelight casting restless shadows across the tiled walls. "What do you mean, files?" Liam's throat bobbed as he swallowed again. "Documents. Medical reports. Old records. Some of them were from before I was even born." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I thought maybe they were just my dad's way of keeping track of everything, but then I saw something that didn't make sense." Elena's skin prickled. "What didn't make sense?" Liam hesitated, like he was about to drop something heavy, something irreversible. "My birth certificate," he said finally. "It was a copy." "But it wasn't," he exhaled sharply. "Elena, my dad isn't my biological father." The words hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Richard wasn't Liam's father?" "That's not possible," she said automatically, shaking her head. "Of course he's your father." Liam let out a dry laugh, his eyes dark with something close to pain. "I thought so too. But there were letters, Elena. Letters from a man my mother used to know. Love letters. And test results. A paternity test my dad ordered when I was a baby." The room felt like it was tilting. She had known Richard had always been strict with Liam, but she had assumed it was just because of who he was, a man who expected perfection, who believed discipline was the foundation of success. But now, another possibility slithered through her mind. Had he known? All this time, had he been raising another man's son, resenting him for it? "Does he know that you know?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Liam shook his head. "No. Not yet. But I think my mom did. I think she kept it from him for as long as she could." Elena inhaled shakily, her mind racing. If Richard had known, if he had always known, how had that shaped the years of distance, the coldness that had seeped into their home? Had he married Elena for love, or had she simply been another piece in a life he was trying to control? She felt suddenly sick, the cool water pressing against her skin like a weight. Liam's voice cut through the silence. "There's more." She forced herself to look at him. His expression was raw, his face pale. "The letters," he said, voice tight. "They weren't just from any man." Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. He swallowed. "They were from my uncle." A strange, hollow sensation filled Elena's chest. "Your uncle?" she echoed. Liam nodded. "My mother's brother." Elena's breath caught. She couldn't process what he was saying. She couldn't make it fit, couldn't make sense of the words that were tumbling into the space between them like shattered glass. Richard's wife, Liam's mother, had an affair. Not just with another man. With her own brother. Elena felt her stomach twist, nausea creeping up her throat. Liam was staring at her now, as if waiting for her to say something, anything. But there were no words for this. No words for the quiet horror settling over her, thick as the steam that still clung to the air. She had thought she understood the cracks in their family. She had thought she knew the shape of the secrets lurking beneath the surface. But she had been wrong. She had been so terribly, terrifyingly wrong. Elena barely remembered how she got out of the tub. The warm water had turned ice-cold around her, but she hadn't felt it. She hadn't felt anything except the weight of Liam's words pressing down on her chest, suffocating, inescapable. Now, wrapped in a robe, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the floor. The room around her was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows against the walls. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Her mind raced in a feverish loop, trying to process what Liam had told her. Richard wasn't his father. His mother had an affair. Not just an affair, a child born from something unspeakable, something twisted beyond comprehension. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, willing the nausea rising in her throat to subside. She wanted to disbelieve him, to tell herself that Liam had misunderstood, that he was mistaken, that this was some cruel coincidence. But the look in his eyes, the raw agony in his voice, there had been no doubt. And the letters. He had proof. A part of her wanted to run. To get up, walk out of the house, and never look back. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she confronted Richard. When he finally came home, it was past midnight. The familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a shiver through her, as if she were hearing it for the first time, as if the man she had been waiting for wasn't her husband, but a stranger she had never truly known. She stood in the middle of their bedroom, waiting. Her heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her fingertips. The door opened, and Richard stepped inside. He looked tired, his suit slightly wrinkled, the scent of his cologne mingling with the crisp night air that followed him in. He barely glanced at her as he set his briefcase down. "You're still up," he said, his voice carrying its usual detachment. He loosened his tie, turning toward the closet. Elena's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "I need to talk to you," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples as he walked past her. "Can it wait until morning? It's been a long day." "No," she said sharply. Something in her tone must have caught his attention because he finally looked at her. His expression flickered with mild curiosity, but not concern. She took a step closer, her chest tightening. "Who is Liam's real father?" For a moment, Richard didn't react. It was only a second, but she saw it, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in his posture, the way his fingers froze mid-motion as he reached for his watch. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Elena," he said, exhaling, shaking his head slightly. "Where is this coming from?" Her skin prickled. He wasn't denying it. "Liam found the files," she said. "The paternity test. The letters." Richard's face remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened slightly. "And—" Elena's breath hitched. "And," she repeated, incredulous. "You've known all this time and never told him?" "Never told me." Richard sighed again, rubbing his jaw. He looked at her the way one might look at a child throwing a tantrum, mildly irritated, but ultimately unimpressed. "It wasn't your business to know," he said simply. Elena's hands trembled. "Not my," she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You let that boy grow up thinking you were his father. You let him believe. It was better that way." The calmness in Richard's voice sent a chill through her. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't remorseful. He was cold. Elena took a slow step back. "Better for who?" Richard finally met her gaze fully. "For everyone." She felt something inside her crack, something irreparable. "His mother," she said, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. "Did she know that you knew?" Richard was silent. A knot tightened in Elena's stomach. "You resented her, didn't you?" she whispered. That's why she cut herself off, her mind piecing together fragments of moments she hadn't fully understood before. The way Richard had spoken about his first wife, the way he never reminisced, never showed the kind of sorrow one might expect from a widower. "You didn't love her," she realized. Richard let out a soft scoff, shaking his head. You really think love had anything to do with it? Elena's breath caught. She had expected denial, anger, maybe even guilt. But Richard wasn't ashamed. Her pulse roared in her ears. What are you saying? Richard studied her for a long moment, then sighed, as if he had finally grown bored of the conversation. She was going to leave, he said flatly. Elena felt a cold rush of dread. What? Richard turned away, slipping off his watch with practiced ease. She told me she was taking Liam and leaving. That she had made a mistake, that she wanted to start over somewhere else. Elena's mouth went dry. She was afraid, she whispered. Richard glanced at her. I gave her no reason to be. A silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Something dark unfurled in Elena's mind, a thought so terrifying she barely allowed herself to acknowledge it. The accident. That's what everyone had called it. A car crash. Wet roads. A tragic, unforeseen event. But what if? Her breath came shallow now, her body rigid. Did you? She stopped herself, swallowed hard, then tried again. Did you have something to do with her death? Richard stared at her, his expression still unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. You should get some rest, he said, walking past her toward the bathroom. Elena's body remained frozen in place as the sound of running water filled the silence he had left behind. She realized, with an overwhelming sense of dread, that she had spent years living with a man she didn't truly know. And worse, he knew that now she did. Elena had spent days and a days, moving through the house like a ghost, her mind unraveling the past piece by piece. Every memory of Richard, every carefully controlled interaction, now carried the weight of suspicion. The way he had always spoken about his first wife so dismissively. The way he had never seemed particularly affectionate toward Liam, never fully fatherly. The way his touch, his presence, had begun to feel like something calculated rather than loving. But she needed more than instinct. She needed proof. Richard had left for another business trip at least. That was the excuse he had given. But Elena no longer believed in his trips, no longer trusted the neat schedules and carefully curated alibis. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, she was moving, her heartbeat a steady roar in her ears. She went straight to his office. The safe was where Liam had said it would be, hidden behind an old painting, one of the few pieces in the house Richard had chosen himself. It was locked this time, but that didn't surprise her. Richard was meticulous. But he had also underestimated her. The code. She stood in front of it, exhaling slowly, then tried the first combination that came to mind. Liam's birthday. The lock clicked. Her stomach twisted as she pulled the door open. Inside, the files were still there, a neat stack of documents, folders, and papers that had no business being kept secret. She pulled them out, flipping through quickly, scanning the contents. The paternity test. The letters between Liam's mother and the man who was really his father. The proof that Richard had known all along. But there was more. Much more. Another folder. Thicker. More recent. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were surveillance photos. Of her. Elena's breath caught. There were pages of them. Images of her at the grocery store, at her favorite cafe, walking through the park. Some were taken from a distance, others close enough that she could see the expression on her own face. She flipped through, a sickening realization settling in her stomach. These weren't just random moments. These were specific. She found one from months ago, sitting at a restaurant, laughing over dinner. With Liam. The memory slammed into her like a wave. It had been one of the few nights Richard had been away, one of the rare times she and Liam had let their walls down, had shared something resembling ease in each other's company. Had Richard seen them? Her hands shook as she reached for the next document. A printed report. A private investigator's notes. She scanned the words, her vision blurring with disbelief. Richard had been having her followed. 4 months. He had known every move she made. Every time she had been alone with Liam, every time she had taken a drive without telling him, every moment he had deemed suspicious. Her heart pounded, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This wasn't just paranoia. This was control. She dug further, reaching for another set of documents, and when she saw the contents, a strangled sound escaped her lips. Her own medical records. Her stomach twisted as she read the details. Tests she didn't remember taking. Appointments she had never scheduled. Reports about her health that had never been shared with her. And then, a prescription. Her name. Richard's signature. She didn't recognize the medication, but the name sent a jolt of unease through her. She pulled out her phone, her hands unsteady as she typed it into a search engine. What she found made her stomach drop. A sedative. Something used to induce fatigue, confusion. Something used in long-term, low doses to make a person compliant, unaware of changes in their own behavior. Elena's pulse slammed against her ribs. He had been drugging her. Slowly. Subtly. For how long? She pressed a hand to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. The sleepless nights, the exhaustion that had seemed to come from nowhere. The time she had struggled to focus, to remember details, to piece together moments that should have been clear. He had been keeping her under control. Richard wasn't just a liar. He was a monster. The sound of the front door opening jolted her out of her spiraling thoughts. Elena's head snapped up. He was home. Too soon. She scrambled to shove the papers back into the safe, her pulse hammering, her fingers fumbling. Footsteps echoed down the hall. She barely had time to close the safe before the office door creaked open. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Her mouth went dry. "You're back early," she managed, her voice too tight, too forced. He tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the room, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the safe. "I changed my flight," he said, stepping inside. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it. Something sharp. She swallowed hard, willing herself to stay composed. "I needed to talk to you," he continued. Elena clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "About what?" she asked, careful to keep her tone even. Richard exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Then, finally, "I know what you've been doing." A cold wave of dread washed over her. She kept her face blank. "What are you talking about?" He took another step closer, his presence suffocating. "You and Liam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Elena's breath hitched. He thought. "No." She shook her head. "That's not." Richard's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, his grip like iron. "Do not lie to me," he hissed. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to stay still. She met his gaze, and for the first time in their marriage, she saw him clearly. A man who had built his life on control. A man who had manipulated, deceived, and eliminated anything that threatened his perfect world. A man who would do anything to keep that control intact. Elena's body went cold. She knew, in that moment, that she wasn't safe. Not anymore. Not ever. But she also knew one more thing. She wasn't going to let him win. Elena had always believed that trust was something solid, something built brick by brick over time. She had believed that love, once given, was a kind of currency that could not be devalued. But she had been wrong. Trust was not solid at all. It was fragile, like glass. And once it shattered, no amount of effort could piece it back together without the cracks showing. She sat in a quiet cafe far from the house that had once been her home, staring at the untouched coffee in front of her. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed. People hurried past, lost in their own lives, unaware that hers had unraveled entirely. It was strange, the way life continued, indifferent to the destruction happening inside a person. Richard was gone. Not gone in the way she had once wished for, not erased from existence, not punished in some dramatic, righteous way. But gone from her world. She had left. She had packed a bag, walked out, and never looked back. She had thought about revenge. She had thought about exposing him, about making him suffer the way he had made her suffer. But in the end, she realized that was still a form of attachment. Still a way of holding on to the man who had tried to erase her. She wanted more than revenge. She wanted freedom. The past few weeks had been a reckoning. She had combed through her memories, questioning everything. Every conversation, every touch, every moment that had once seemed ordinary. Had he ever truly loved her? Or had she simply been a role to fill, a carefully chosen piece in the perfect image he had built for himself? She thought about Liam. About the way his life had been built on lies just as much as hers had. The way he had spent years unknowingly carrying the weight of a secret he had never been meant to find. How much of a person's identity was shaped by the lies told to them. She had reached out to him after she left. Not to explain, not to try and fix anything because some things could not be fixed, but just to say that she knew how he felt. That she understood what it was like to have the foundation of your life pulled out from under you. Liam had listened. He hadn't said much. But before she hung up, he had thanked her. And that was enough. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger, staring at the rippling surface. Betrayal was not always loud. Sometimes it was a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of everything a person thought was real. It was in the missed glances, the unspoken words, the secrets buried just beneath the surface. But the worst betrayal was the one a person committed against themselves. The one where they ignored the signs, silenced their instincts, and convinced themselves that everything was fine. She would never make that mistake again. Elena didn't know where she was going next. She had no plan, no neat roadmap to follow. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't terrify her. She had spent years living under the illusion of safety, of certainty. And in the end, it had been nothing more than a beautifully crafted lie. Maybe life wasn't meant to be certain. Maybe it was meant to be messy, unpredictable, raw. She exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the past slip from her shoulders, even if just for a moment. As she lifted her coffee to her lips, she let herself wonder. If you found out everything you believed was a lie, what would you do? Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you simply walk away and start again?